Hi, thank you for joining us once more on Boring History for Sleep. I'm already feeling quite sleepy myself. Hope you are too. If this is your first time drifting along with us, a special welcome. If you find yourself enjoying this little trip back in time, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button and perhaps even the like button if you're feeling generous. It helps others find our sleepy corner of history. Okay, right then. As we dim the lights on the present, take a nice, deep breath. Let go of any tension you're holding on to, and just let your mind wander with us. Tonight, we're drifting back, way back, to the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and, well, a whole lot of creepy crawlies. We're heading to ancient Egypt to explore something you probably didn't see in the glossy museum exhibits: how ordinary people dealt with pests. And let me tell you, spoiler alert, it was often pretty gross. Imagine yourself not as a powerful pharaoh or a high priest, but as, let's say, a farmer living near the Nile, or maybe a craftsperson in a bustling town like Thebes. Picture the warmth, the constant sun beating down. You can almost feel the dry air, smell the earthy scent of the river mud mixed with baking bread, maybe some incense drifting from a nearby temple, and something else, something less pleasant, the faint but persistent buzz of flies. Flies were everywhere. Not just a few annoying ones like we might swat away today. Think clouds of them, especially near any kind of food preparation, waste disposal areas which weren't exactly sophisticated, or down by the riverbanks where the fertile mud bred them by the millions. They'd land on your food as you tried to eat, crawl on your face while you tried to sleep, swarm around any open wound. You'd be constantly waving your hands, maybe using a makeshift fly whisk made of reeds or palm fibers, but it was a losing battle. They were just a fact of life, an ever-present, buzzing, irritating backdrop to everything you did. And they weren't just annoying. People back then didn't understand germ theory, but they certainly saw the connection between flies swarming on filth and then landing on food, and the subsequent stomach troubles or eye infections that seemed to follow. Okay, so flies are bad enough. Now, let's talk about something bigger. Locusts. We see them occasionally in the news today, causing devastation. But in ancient Egypt, dependent as they were on agriculture in the Nile Valley, a locust swarm was apocalyptic. Imagine looking up and seeing the sky darken, not with clouds, but with millions, billions of clicking, whirring insects descending on your precious fields of wheat or barley. The sound alone would be terrifying, a deafening roar of wings and chewing. You and your entire village would rush out, banging pots, shouting, waving cloths, trying desperately to scare them away, but it was often futile. They could strip a field bare in hours, leaving behind devastation and the very real threat of famine. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence for the community. And when the sun went down, things didn't necessarily get better. That's when the other critters came out. Picture your simple mud brick home. Cozy, perhaps, but definitely not sealed tight like our modern houses. Cracks in the walls, gaps under the door, maybe a thatched roof. Perfect entry points for mice and rats. You'd hear them scurrying in the walls or ceiling at night, little scratching sounds that would make your skin crawl. They'd get into your grain stores, a disaster, because that grain was your food for months. You'd try to store it in pottery jars, maybe elevate them, but the rodents were persistent. They'd chew through baskets, find ways into containers, contaminate your food supply with their droppings. People tried cats, of course. Egyptians famously revered cats, partly for their companionship, but very practically for their mousing skills. But even the best cat couldn't handle a serious infestation. Traps existed, simple clay pots or contraptions, but rodents breed fast. It was a constant battle to protect your food, and it wasn't just rodents. Snakes were a common fear, especially species like the asp or cobra found in the region. They might seek shelter from the heat in the cool darkness of a home, or hide in storage jars or piles of reeds. Imagine reaching for something and disturbing a venomous snake. Scorpion stings were another everyday hazard, these little arachnids hiding in shoes, bedding, or under rocks. While maybe not always fatal to a healthy adult, their sting was incredibly painful and could be deadly for children or the elderly. People relied on magical amulets, spells, and folk remedies, alongside trying to keep their homes clear, but the danger was always lurking, just out of sight. This constant low-level hum of potential danger from the smallest of creatures was just part of the background noise of life. All right, so we've dodged the locust swarms for now, shooed away most of the flies, and maybe set a cat on those pesky rats. But the battle against the tiny invaders wasn't just about protecting your food or avoiding a nasty bite. It got much, much more personal. Let's talk about the things that decided to make you their home. Yeah, I'm talking lice and fleas. Imagine the closed living quarters, the heat, the fact that bathing wasn't always a daily luxury, especially for the working class. It was paradise for these little bloodsuckers. Head lice? Oh, absolutely rampant. You'd feel that constant maddening itch on your scalp. Kids were especially prone, passing them around easily. People tried combing them out with fine-toothed combs made of wood or bone. Archaeologists find these all the time. They might have used certain oils or herbal concoctions, hoping to deter or kill them, but mostly it was just an itchy reality you had to endure. Think about trying to sleep with your head constantly itching, or trying to focus on intricate craft work while feeling things crawling in your hair. Not exactly relaxing, is it? And then there were fleas, hopping from pets, from livestock, from textiles, from the very earth floor of your home. They'd bite anywhere, leaving little red, itchy welts. Again, cleanliness was the best defense, but hard to maintain perfectly. People might have tried using strong-smelling herbs in their bedding, hoping to repel them, things like mint or wormwood. Did it work? Probably not very well. You'd just scratch and scratch, sometimes until you broke the skin, opening yourself up to infections. Another problem we'll get to. Speaking of infections, let's zoom in on the eyes for a moment. Remember all those flies we mentioned? They weren't just buzzing annoyances. They were major carriers of eye diseases like trachoma. It's a nasty bacterial infection that, left untreated, can cause scarring on the inside of the eyelid, eventually leading to blindness as the eyelashes turn inward and scrape the cornea. It was incredibly common in ancient Egypt, likely due to the flies, dust, and lack of clean water for washing. Imagine your eyes constantly feeling gritty, sore, maybe oozing. Your vision slowly clouding over years. They had treatments, of course. Papyrus scrolls mention various remedies. Applying concoctions made from minerals like coal, which had some antibacterial properties due to lead, ironically. Animal fats, honey, also antibacterial, or various plants. Sometimes these might have helped soothe symptoms. Other times, well, putting weird stuff in your already infected eyes probably didn't always end well. It was a constant struggle against gradual blindness for many. And let's not forget what went on inside your body. Intestinal parasites were almost a given. Think worms, tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, likely contracted from contaminated water, poorly cooked food, especially fish from the Nile, or just general lack of sanitation. You might feel constantly drained, weak, suffer from stomach pains, diarrhea, or anemia without ever knowing exactly why. Again, they had remedies, often involving potent herbs meant to purge the system, like castor oil or senna. Sometimes these worked, sometimes they just made you feel even worse. It was all a bit of a gamble, based on observation and a hefty dose of magical thinking. Life was a constant negotiation with these unseen internal enemies, draining your energy day by day. So, you managed to survive the night without being carried off by rats or drained dry by fleas. Good start, but now it's morning and you're thirsty. You head down to the lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile. It looks majestic, wide, flowing, and absolutely teeming with things that could make you incredibly sick or even kill you. Think about it. The Nile was everything. It was the source of irrigation for crops, the main highway for transport, the place people bathed, washed clothes, watered their animals. And yes, where waste often ended up, either directly or indirectly through runoff. Clean drinking water, as we understand it, wasn't really a concept. You might let the water settle in a jar to get rid of the obvious mud, or maybe use filters made of cloth or pottery, but microscopic nasties. They had no idea. One of the big invisible threats lurking in that water was schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia. It's caused by parasitic flatworms released by freshwater snails that thrive in slow-moving or stagnant water, like irrigation canals or marshy areas along the Nile banks. You wouldn't even know you were infected at first. Maybe you waded into the water to fetch something, wash yourself, or work in the fields. The tiny larvae burrow right through your skin. Weeks later, you might get a fever, chills, maybe a cough or muscle aches, easily mistaken for something else. But the real damage happens over years as the worms mature in your blood vessels and lay eggs. These eggs get trapped in organs like the bladder or intestines, causing chronic inflammation, pain, blood in the urine, a very common symptom noted in ancient texts, and severe damage to internal organs over time. It could lead to bladder cancer, kidney failure, liver damage, a slow, debilitating decline. And it was incredibly common. Mummies show evidence of it. It was just another part of life's grim lottery by the river. And schistosomiasis wasn't the only waterborne menace. Bacterial infections causing dysentery and other severe gastrointestinal illnesses were rampant. Think cholera-like diseases, typhoid fever, anything spread through fecal contamination of water. One bad batch of water, one contaminated handful used to wash food, and you could be struck down with violent diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. In a world without IV drips or antibiotics, severe dehydration was often fatal, especially for children and the elderly. People would rely on herbal remedies, prayers, maybe trying to drink boiled water if they were knowledgeable, but often it was simply down to luck and the strength of your constitution. Beyond the microscopic threats, the Nile itself held visible dangers. Crocodiles were a very real hazard, especially for fishermen, people fetching water near the banks, or children playing too close. Imagine the sudden terror of seeing those eyes break the surface, the explosive lunge. Hippos, too, often seen as comical today, are actually one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They're fiercely territorial, especially protective mothers, and could easily capsize a small boat or attack someone on the riverbank. Drowning was also a constant risk, whether from falling off a boat, getting caught in currents, or during the annual inundation when the floodwaters rose dramatically. The river gave life, but it demanded respect and could snatch life away in an instant. Okay, let's step away from the riverbank for a bit, maybe dry ourselves off, and think about just working, earning your daily bread or beer, which was a staple payment. Sounds simple enough, right? But even the most common jobs in ancient Egypt were riddled with hazards that could mess you up, slowly or very, very quickly. Take farming, the backbone of the civilization. We already mentioned the risk of parasites from the irrigation canals. But think about the physical toll. Hours spent bending over in the hot sun, planting, weeding, harvesting. Back problems must have been incredibly common. Then there was the risk of injury from simple tools. A slip of a sickle could cause a nasty gash. And working with livestock, getting kicked, gored, or bitten by oxen or donkeys was a real possibility. Plus, dust. Dry, dusty fields, especially during harvest or threshing, meant constantly inhaling fine particles of dirt, chaff, and goodness knows what else. This could lead to chronic respiratory problems over time, what we might call farmer's lung today. Now, what about the big projects? The pyramids, the temples, the massive statues. Iconic, yes, but built with sweat, blood, and broken bones. Imagine quarrying huge blocks of stone using rudimentary tools, maybe just copper chisels and stone pounders. Accidents were inevitable. Blocks slipping, crushing limbs or worse. The sheer physical exertion in the relentless heat. Then, transporting these colossal stones, often weighing many tons, using ropes, sledges, and sheer manpower. Think of the potential for snapped ropes, runaway blocks, hernias, severe muscle strains, and exhaustion leading to carelessness, and more accidents. And the construction sites themselves? Working high up on scaffolding made of wood and reeds, the risk of falls must have been terrifyingly high. Add to that the constant inhalation of stone dust from cutting and shaping the blocks, leading to silicosis, a deadly lung disease, though they wouldn't have known the cause, just that stonemasons often coughed themselves into an early grave. Even seemingly less strenuous jobs had their dangers. Scribes, hunched over their papyrus scrolls for hours, likely suffered from eye strain in poor light, neck, and back pain, much like office workers today, but without the ergonomic chairs. Craftspeople, potters inhaling clay dust, weavers breathing in fiber particles, metal workers exposed to fumes and heat, tanners, as we discussed in another context, dealing with truly vile substances and risks. Every profession had its own set of dangers, its own way of slowly or suddenly breaking down the human body. There was no health and safety committee, no workers' compensation. An injury could mean not just pain, but the inability to work. And for many, that meant destitution for their entire family. Just another layer of precariousness in daily life. Right, so you've somehow avoided drowning, being eaten, getting riddled with parasites from the water, and haven't yet been crushed by a giant stone block at work. Time to eat. Food, glorious food. Except, keeping food safe and edible in the Egyptian heat without refrigeration was a constant uphill battle, and another way pests and sickness could sneak into your life. Bread and beer were staples, made from grains like emmer wheat and barley. But storing grain, as we touched on with the rats, was tricky. Even if you kept the rodents out, insects were another major problem. Weevils, beetles, and their larvae could infest stored grain, turning your precious food supply into a wriggling, dusty mess. You might try to sift them out, but chances are you were eating a fair amount of insect protein, whether you liked it or not. And damp grain, that could lead to mold, including molds that produce nasty toxins, mycotoxins. Eating moldy bread wasn't just unpleasant, it could make you seriously ill, causing stomach issues, or worse over the long term. What about meat and fish? Luxury items for many, but also quick to spoil. Fish caught from the Nile had to be eaten quickly, salted, or dried in the sun. Salting and drying helped preserve them, but wasn't foolproof. Imagine the flies swarming around fish laid out to dry. Yeah. Meat, like poultry, beef, or goat, would also spoil rapidly in the heat. Wealthier households might have dedicated kitchens and ways to cook meat thoroughly, but for many, preserving it meant salting or smoking. Again, improper preservation could easily lead to bacterial growth. Think Salmonella, E. coli, causing severe food poisoning. You might eat something that tasted a little off, hoping for the best, only to spend the next day or two regretting it profoundly, doubled over with cramps and worse. Even fruits and vegetables weren't entirely safe. They could be contaminated by unclean water used for irrigation, by animal droppings in the fields, or simply by being handled with unwashed hands. Eating raw vegetables or fruits without thorough washing in potentially contaminated water, remember, could transmit all sorts of bacteria and parasites. Think about buying produce from a bustling market stall, flies buzzing around, dust settling everywhere. It wasn't exactly a sterile environment. And then there were the attempts at preservation that sound downright bizarre to us. Honey was used, which has natural antibacterial properties, so that was a good call. But other methods might involve various herbs or minerals, some of which might have been ineffective or even harmful. The constant threat of food spoilage meant that sometimes people ate things they probably shouldn't have, simply out of necessity or lack of understanding. That slightly sour milk, that piece of dried fish that smells a bit funky. Sometimes you just had to risk it. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was another daily gamble with your health. All right, we've talked about dirty water, dangerous jobs, and dodgy food. But what about just keeping clean? Personal hygiene in ancient Egypt was a mixed bag, and often another area where pests and disease found an easy way in, especially if you weren't wealthy. Bathing was certainly valued. The Nile was used, as were basins of water at home if you could manage it. Wealthier Egyptians might have dedicated bathing areas, using natron, a natural soda ash, as a cleansing agent, kind of like soap. They also loved their cosmetics and perfumes, partly to smell good, but maybe also partly to mask the less pleasant smells of daily life and poor sanitation. But for the average farmer or labourer, a full bath might have been infrequent. A quick rinse in the canal, hello, schistosomiasis, or a splash from a jar might be all you got most days. And washing clothes, again, often done in the river or canals, potentially spreading contaminants. Then there's dental hygiene. Egyptians seem to have suffered quite a bit with their teeth. Not so much from cavities, as their diet was low in sugar, but from extreme wear. Their stone-ground flour contained a lot of grit, sand, and tiny bits of stone. Chewing this gritty bread day after day wore down enamel incredibly fast, sometimes right down to the pulp. This exposed the sensitive inner parts of the tooth, leading to abscesses, infections, and intense pain. Imagine constant throbbing toothache with very limited options for relief. They did have some dental practices. Papyri mention remedies for loose teeth or gum problems, often involving pastes or mouth rinses with herbs and minerals. There's even some evidence of rudimentary attempts at bridging or packing teeth, but extraction was likely the most common solution for a severely painful or infected tooth. An extraction without modern anesthetics or sterile tools? Yeah, not fun. Plus, severe dental infections could sometimes spread, leading to systemic illness or even death. And what about waste disposal? In towns and villages, there wasn't exactly a modern sewage system. Some wealthier homes might have had basic latrines, maybe a seat over a removable container filled with sand. But for many, it was a case of using a designated spot outside the home, or simply finding a quiet alley or field. Chamber pots were used, and their contents often just tossed into the street or onto refuse heaps. These heaps, teeming with human and animal waste, food scraps, and other garbage, were breeding grounds for flies, rats, and disease. Even if your own home was relatively clean, the environment just outside your door could be incredibly unsanitary, constantly exposing you to pathogens. It's this close proximity to waste that fueled the cycles of flies, contaminated water, and diseases like dysentery we talked about earlier. Keeping truly clean, in the modern sense, was almost impossible for most people. So, inevitably, despite your best efforts to avoid contaminated water, dodgy food, and hazardous workplaces, you get sick or injured. What happens then? Well, you'd likely seek out a physician, known as a SW, pronounced Sunu. But Egyptian medicine was a fascinating and sometimes terrifying blend of practical observation, religious belief, and outright magic. Physicians were trained professionals, often associated with temples. They did understand some things surprisingly well. They knew about the pulse, the importance of cleanliness in treating wounds, sometimes, and they were skilled at setting broken bones. Mummies show fractures that healed remarkably well. They had a whole pharmacopoeia of remedies derived from plants, minerals, and animals. Honey, as mentioned, was widely used for wounds due to its antibacterial properties. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, like aspirin, might have been used for pain. Various herbs were prescribed for everything from coughs to indigestion. But their understanding of disease causation was different. While they observed symptoms, they often attributed illness to supernatural causes, the wrath of gods, the influence of evil spirits, or disturbances in the body's channels, metu, caused by malevolent entities or even pests acting as agents of chaos. So, treatment wasn't just about physical remedies, it was also about appeasing the gods or driving out the evil influence. This is where things get weird. Alongside practical treatments, a physician might prescribe magical spells or amulets. You might be given a potion to drink while reciting an incantation to banish the demon causing your fever. Wounds might be dressed with poultices containing ingredients that seem utterly bizarre to us, like crocodile dung or fly droppings. Why? Perhaps based on sympathetic magic, like cures like, or maybe just desperation and tradition. Imagine having a festering wound packed with dung. The risk of tetanus or secondary infection would be astronomical. Yet these practices are documented in medical papyri like the Ebers Papyrus, and pests themselves were often incorporated into cures. Need a remedy for baldness? Maybe rub bat's blood on your scalp. Got splinters? A poultice involving worms might be suggested. It seems counterintuitive, even dangerous, but it reflects a worldview where the lines between the natural, supernatural, and the downright gross were very blurry. Sometimes, treatments might have accidentally worked. Maybe the acidity of dung inhibited some bacteria, or perhaps the placebo effect of a powerful spell was enough to help the body heal itself. But often, the cure could be just as dangerous, if not more so, than the original ailment. Going to the doctor in ancient Egypt was always a bit of a gamble. Beyond the physical suffering, the itching, the pain, the weakness, living in this constant state of siege by pests and disease must have taken a heavy mental toll. Imagine the anxiety. Every sip of water, every meal, every step into the fields carried a potential risk. You wouldn't understand the germ theory or the life cycles of parasites, so illness would often seem random, unpredictable, maybe even like a punishment from disgruntled gods or the result of witchcraft. Think about the constant discomfort, never feeling truly clean because of fleas or lice. The nagging worry about your stored grain being devoured by rats or weevils. The fear of blindness from recurring eye infections. The dread of the locust swarm wiping out your livelihood. This wasn't just physical hardship. It was a background hum of stress and anxiety that permeated daily life. How could you truly relax when danger, seen and unseen, lurked everywhere? And what about social stigma? While some ailments were common, others might have marked you out. Skin diseases, for example, whether leprosy, though its exact nature in ancient Egypt is debated, fungal infections, or chronic ulcers, could lead to social isolation. People might fear contagion, even if they didn't understand how it spread, or simply be repulsed by visible afflictions. The medical papyri sometimes describe isolating individuals with certain conditions. Imagine being shunned by your community, unable to participate in festivals or family gatherings, simply because of an ailment you couldn't control. Even less visible conditions could impact your social standing. Chronic weakness from parasites or respiratory problems from dusty work could affect your ability to contribute labor, potentially making you a burden on your family or village. In a society where everyone needed to pull their weight, being perceived as weak or constantly ill could be socially damaging. And then there's the sheer fatalism that might set in, seeing children frequently fall ill and die, witnessing neighbors succumb to sudden fevers or wasting diseases, experiencing plagues of locusts or outbreaks of dysentery. It could foster a sense of powerlessness against the forces of nature and the divine. While Egyptians were generally pragmatic and resilient, the constant exposure to suffering and death must have shaped their worldview, perhaps reinforcing the importance of appeasing the gods and ensuring a proper afterlife, as this life was often so fraught with peril. The psychological burden of living with so many pests, parasites, and diseases was an invisible, yet heavy part of the ancient Egyptian experience. Given the often ineffective, sometimes downright dangerous medical treatments and the constant, unavoidable exposure to pests and disease, it's no surprise that magic and religion played a huge role in how ancient Egyptians tried to cope. When practical measures failed, or when illness seemed to strike from nowhere, people turned to the divine and the mystical for protection and cures. You wouldn't just rely on the SW&W, the physician. You might also consult priests or magicians who specialized in healing spells and rituals. Specific deities were invoked for protection against certain ailments or creatures. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, was powerful and feared, associated with both plague and healing. You definitely wanted to stay on her good side. Isis, the great mother goddess, was often called upon for her healing and protective magic, especially for women and children. Taweret, the hippo goddess, was a protector of childbirth, a particularly dangerous time. And then there were amulets. These weren't just jewelry. They were potent magical objects believed to offer real protection. You'd see people wearing the Wedjat eye, the Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of healing, restoration, and protection against evil. Figures of the dwarf god Bez, a grotesque but benevolent deity, were thought to ward off snakes, scorpions, and evil spirits, especially protecting households and children. Scarab beetles, representing rebirth and regeneration, were also popular amulets for general well-being. Specific amulets might be worn to guard against scorpion stings or snake bites. These weren't seen as alternatives to practical measures, but as essential additional layers of defense in a dangerous world. You'd wear your amulet and try to watch where you stepped. Spells and incantations were crucial. Medical papyri often include magical spells alongside medical recipes. A physician might apply a poultice while reciting a charm to empower the ingredients or command the diseased demon to leave the patient's body. There were spells specifically aimed at driving away pests, incantations against rats, flies, or snakes. Imagine a homeowner walking through their house, chanting specific words, perhaps leaving offerings, desperately trying to magically cleanse their space of unseen threats or tiny invaders. Did it work? Physically, probably not, but psychologically, believing you had some magical recourse, some way to appeal to the gods or actively fight back against the forces causing misery, must have provided immense comfort and a sense of agency in situations that otherwise felt overwhelming and random. Magic wasn't just superstition, it was a vital coping mechanism. So, we've navigated daily life, work, food, illness, and even magic. But there was one area where the intersection of pests, poor hygiene, and limited medical knowledge was particularly brutal: childbirth and infancy. Bringing new life into the world was, for an ancient Egyptian woman, one of the most dangerous things she could do, and keeping that new life alive through its first few years was a constant, heartbreaking struggle. Imagine giving birth not in a sterile hospital ward, but likely at home, perhaps on a special birthing stool or bricks, attended by midwives and female relatives. While midwives possessed practical knowledge passed down through generations, their understanding of infection control was minimal. Unwashed hands, unclean cloths, delivery onto surfaces potentially contaminated with animal or human waste. The risk of puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a deadly bacterial infection following childbirth, was terrifyingly high. A joyous event could quickly turn tragic, leaving a newborn motherless. Pests played their part here too. Flies would be attracted to the blood and fluids of birth, potentially transmitting infections directly to the mother or the vulnerable newborn. Tetanus was another major risk, caused by bacteria found in soil and animal dung entering the body through the raw umbilical stump, if not handled cleanly, or through any tears sustained by the mother during delivery. Spasms, lockjaw, a truly horrific way to go for mother or child. And if the baby survived the birth, the first few years were incredibly perilous. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high compared to modern standards. Diarrheal diseases, often from contaminated water or milk, were a massive killer of infants and young children. Dehydration could set in incredibly quickly in a tiny body. Respiratory infections, common colds turning into pneumonia in crowded, smoky homes, were another major threat. Weaning could be a dangerous time too, introducing new foods potentially contaminated with bacteria or parasites. Malnutrition also played a role, weakening children and making them more susceptible to diseases they might otherwise survive. While mothers breastfed, often for extended periods, supplementary foods might not always be adequate or clean. And those ever-present pests. Flies landing on a baby's eyes could transmit trachoma early on. Mosquitoes, yes they had them too, especially near the marshes, could transmit fevers. Lice and fleas would readily infest infants. It was a relentless assault on a tiny developing immune system. Parents relied heavily on protective magic, amulets like the Bez figure placed near the baby, and prayers to goddesses like Isis and Taweret, alongside whatever practical care they could provide. Losing multiple children in infancy was a tragically common experience, a deep sorrow woven into the fabric of family life. We've spent a lot of time near the fertile Nile Valley, the heartland of Egypt. But let's not forget the vast, harsh desert that surrounded it, the Red Land, as they called it, in contrast to the fertile, black land by the river. While most people lived near the Nile, the desert wasn't empty. It was crossed by trade caravans. Miners went there seeking precious stones and metals, and border patrols kept watch. And the desert had its own unique set of pests and dangers. First, the obvious: the heat and the sun. Heat stroke and severe dehydration were constant threats for anyone venturing away from the river's relief. Imagine traveling for days under that relentless glare. Water supplies dwindling. Your body struggles to cope, leading to confusion, collapse, and potentially death. Egyptians knew to travel early or late in the day, to cover themselves and to conserve water. But the desert was unforgiving of mistakes. Then there were the sandstorms, or Khamsin winds. These could whip up suddenly, turning the sky dark yellow or red with blinding, choking dust and sand. Visibility drops to near zero. The wind howls, stinging your skin, filling your eyes, nose and mouth with grit. Getting caught in a major sandstorm could be terrifying and disorienting. You could lose your way, suffocate, or simply be buried. Even minor exposure meant inhaling vast quantities of fine sand, contributing to the respiratory problems we've already touched upon. And the desert had its own specialized critters, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions. Scorpions, even more prevalent than near the river, hiding under rocks or in crevices, their sting a constant worry. Various species of venomous snakes, like the horned viper, masters of camouflage, blending perfectly with the sand until you almost stepped on them. Imagine the jolt of terror seeing that distinctive horned head rise from the sand right in front of you. Insects adapted to the arid environment were also present. Certain types of beetles, ants, and spiders thrived there. While perhaps not carrying the same waterborne diseases as Nile pests, they could still inflict painful bites or stings, or contaminate scarce food supplies carried by travelers or miners. And let's not forget the psychological aspect. The vast emptiness, the shimmering heat haze playing tricks on your eyes, the feeling of being exposed and vulnerable in that immense, silent landscape. The desert wasn't just physically dangerous, it could wear down your spirit too. It demanded respect, and venturing into it unprepared was often a fatal mistake. We've talked a lot about the sudden dramatic threats, the snake bite, the locust swarm, the bout of dysentery, but ancient Egypt also harbored slower, more insidious killers, diseases that could waste you away over months or years, often hidden from view until it was too late. One prime suspect, haunting the background of Egyptian life, was likely tuberculosis, or something very much like it. We see evidence in the bones. Skeletal remains, particularly spines from mummies, sometimes show the characteristic damage of Pott's disease, a form of tuberculosis that attacks the vertebrae, causing them to collapse and fuse, leading to deformity and pain. Lung lesions suggestive of TB have also been found in some mummified remains. While they wouldn't have called it tuberculosis, or understood it was caused by bacteria, they certainly recognized the symptoms. The persistent cough, sometimes bringing up blood, the gradual weight loss, the fever and night sweats, the profound weakness and fatigue. Imagine someone in your family or village slowly declining like this. They become thinner, paler, constantly coughing. They lack the energy to work. In the crowded living conditions, with people often sleeping close together in poorly ventilated homes, the bacteria could spread easily through airborne droplets from coughs. You wouldn't know how it spread, maybe blaming bad air, divine displeasure, or weakening of the spirit. You'd see this wasting sickness move through families or communities, seemingly at random. What could they do? The medical papyri mention treatments for coughs and chest complaints, often involving honey, herbs, or inhaling fumes from certain substances. These might soothe the symptoms temporarily, but they couldn't cure the underlying infection. Rest and good nutrition might help some individuals with stronger immune systems fight it off, or keep it dormant, but for many, it would be a slow, progressive decline. Think of the emotional toll, Watching a loved one fade away, coughing constantly, growing weaker day by day, with no effective cure available. It adds another layer of somber reality to the picture of ancient health. Not just the acute dangers, but the chronic, wasting diseases that lurked beneath the surface. Now, it's easy to paint a picture of universal suffering. And certainly, many of these problems affected everyone. But let's be real, your experience with pests and disease in ancient Egypt depended heavily on who you were. Being rich didn't make you immune, but it definitely gave you some advantages. Think about housing. A wealthy nobleman or high official lived in a spacious villa, likely built with better materials, maybe even plastered walls, offering fewer cracks and crevices for rodents and insects to hide. They might have had dedicated servants whose job included keeping the place clean, sweeping away debris, and maybe even actively hunting pests. Compare that to the simple, crowded mud brick dwellings of a farmer or labourer, often with earth floors and thatched roofs. Basically, an open invitation for critters. Access to food and water was another differentiator. The wealthy ate a more varied diet, likely including more meat, and had access to cleaner water sources, perhaps from private wells or carefully stored supplies. They were less likely to suffer the chronic malnutrition that weakened the poor and made them susceptible to disease. They could afford to discard spoiled food, while a poor family might have to risk eating something questionable. When illness struck, the rich had better access to physicians, NONW, and perhaps more elaborate treatments, whether effective or not. They could afford the ingredients for prescribed remedies, the amulets, the temple donations. They could also afford to rest and recuperate, waited on by servants. A labourer, on the other hand, might have to keep working through illness just to survive, potentially worsening their condition. They might rely more on cheaper folk remedies or local healers whose knowledge varied greatly. Even exposure to environmental hazards differed. While everyone breathed the same air, wealthy individuals were less likely to be doing the back-breaking, dust-inhaling labour in quarries, fields, or construction sites. They might travel by boat rather than trekking through scorpion-infested deserts. Their homes were likely situated further from the most unsanitary parts of towns or villages. Of course, wealth couldn't protect you from everything. A mosquito carrying malaria wouldn't check your bank balance before biting. A parasite in the Nile didn't care if you owned land. And some diseases might have even been more common among the elite due to richer diets. Gout has been suspected in some mummies, or specific cultural practices. But overall, having resources, better living conditions, better nutrition, and better access to care, such as it was, definitely tipped the odds of survival and relative comfort in your favour. Life was hard for everyone, but it was demonstrably harder and more pest-ridden for the poor. With life being so precarious, filled with pests, diseases, and dangers around every corner, it's perhaps understandable why the ancient Egyptians placed such enormous importance on the afterlife. If this life was often a struggle, maybe the next one could be better, a perfected, eternal version of Egypt, free from suffering. Their elaborate funerary practices weren't just about preserving the body. They were about ensuring a successful transition and a comfortable existence in the hereafter. Mummification itself, while primarily religious, had practical implications related to the pests we've discussed. Properly sealing the body, removing organs prone to rapid decay, and using natron salts for desiccation helped to prevent the corpse from becoming immediate food for maggots, beetles, and bacteria. It was, in a way, the ultimate pest control measure, aimed at preserving the physical form needed for the afterlife journey. Tombs, especially for the elite, were designed as eternal homes. They were filled with provisions, tools, furniture, and even models of servants, everything the deceased might need to live comfortably forever. But these tombs, despite being sealed, weren't immune to pests either. Archaeologists often find evidence of ancient tomb robberies, but also signs of insect or rodent activity that occurred long after the burial. Tiny beetles could bore through wood. Mice might find a way in and nibble at offerings or even the mummy wrappings. The battle against pests continued, in a sense, even after death. Furthermore, the spells and texts included in tombs, like the Book of the Dead, often contained passages aimed at protecting the deceased from dangers in the afterlife, which sometimes mirrored earthly threats. There were spells against snakes and crocodiles, creatures that inhabited the underworld pathways in Egyptian mythology. There were also spells to ensure the deceased had power over decay and corruption, perhaps reflecting the constant earthly battle against things that spoiled or fell apart. The desire for a clean, healthy, pest-free afterlife might also be seen as a direct reaction to the often dirty, disease-ridden reality of life. The idealized depictions in tomb paintings often show lush fields, abundant harvests, and healthy, happy people. A stark contrast to the daily grind and dangers faced by many. It suggests a deep yearning for a world without flies, without parasites, without the constant threat of illness. The afterlife wasn't just about immortality, it was about achieving a state of perfect well-being that was so hard to find on Earth. We know the Egyptians were master builders when it came to temples and pyramids. But what about their everyday homes and storage buildings? Did they even try to build in ways that might keep some of the pests out? Well, yes and no. They certainly tried, within the limits of their materials and understanding, but it was an ongoing battle they often lost. Think about the standard house: mud brick walls, maybe a flat roof made of palm logs covered with mud and reeds, and likely an earth floor. Mud brick itself isn't exactly critter-proof. Insects could burrow into it, mice could gnaw through it eventually, and cracks would inevitably appear as the bricks dried and settled, offering easy entry points. Plastering the walls, both inside and out, which wealthier homeowners could afford, definitely helped. It created a smoother, less hospitable surface and sealed smaller cracks. But plaster could crumble or crack too, especially with temperature changes or dampness. Floors were a major vulnerability. Packed earth floors were common, and easy for insects, scorpions, or even snakes to burrow into or hide within. Paved floors using stone slabs or fired bricks were much better, but again, more expensive, and usually found in temples, palaces, or very wealthy homes. Even then, gaps between paving stones could offer refuge for smaller pests. Roofs were another weak point. Thatched or mud and reed roofs were prime real estate for rats, insects, and nesting birds, whose droppings and parasites added to the problem. Keeping the roof well maintained was crucial, but difficult. Open windows or ventilation shafts, necessary for airflow in the heat, were obviously entry points too, though perhaps sometimes covered with simple wooden lattices or cloth screens that offered minimal protection. Where they put more effort into pest proofing was in food storage, especially state-run granaries, which held the nation's wealth. These were often large, silo-like structures, sometimes raised off the ground on platforms to deter rodents. They might have thicker walls and carefully sealed openings. Scribes meticulously recorded grain levels, partly for accounting, but maybe also to track losses due to spoilage or pests. Yet even here, infestations happened. Weevils and grain beetles could arrive with the grain itself, and rodents are persistent climbers. Cats were often encouraged around granaries as a biological control method. For household storage, pottery jars with lids were the main defense. A well-fitting lid could keep insects and mice out of stored grain, oil, or wine for a while. But pottery can break. Lids might not fit perfectly, and determined rodents could sometimes even gnaw through softer materials used for stoppers. It was a constant effort of maintenance, vigilance, and probably a degree of resignation. You did what you could, but you knew the pests would likely find a way in eventually. Life wasn't all work and worry, though. Ancient Egyptians loved their festivals and celebrations. These were often large public gatherings, involving processions, music, dancing, and crucially, feasting and drinking. Sounds like fun, right? But imagine trying to enjoy a big outdoor party when you're constantly swatting flies away from your food and beer, or worrying about what might be crawling around your feet in the crowd. Feasts often involved large amounts of food prepared and served outdoors, or in temporary shelters. This would be an absolute magnet for flies, ants, and potentially rodents attracted by dropped scraps. Keeping food protected and sanitary during a chaotic festival must have been a nightmare. Communal drinking, often involving shared cups or ladles dipped into large beer jars, was another potential route for spreading germs, especially if someone in the crowd was already sick. Religious festivals often involve processions carrying sacred images or boats from one temple to another. These routes might pass through crowded city streets or along dusty paths. Imagine the clouds of dust kicked up, irritating eyes and lungs, and any offerings of food or drink left out for the gods or consumed by the priests in public afterwards would quickly attract unwanted attention from the local pest population. Even military campaigns weren't immune. Soldiers on the march, living in temporary camps, faced many of the same hygiene challenges as civilians, perhaps even worse. Poor sanitation in camps could lead to outbreaks of dysentery or other diseases, potentially weakening an army more effectively than the enemy. Water sources might be contaminated, rations could spoil or become infested, and soldiers marching through different terrains, including deserts or marshlands, would encounter the local varieties of biting insects, scorpions, and snakes. An army plagued by sickness and discomfort wasn't exactly at peak fighting condition. Pests and disease were an invisible enemy that commanders constantly had to factor in. Even if they didn't fully understand the mechanisms involved, they were just another hardship to be endured in service to the pharaoh. Let's zoom in on a few specific ailments that, while maybe not always fatal, must have made life utterly miserable, often thanks to our tiny pestilent friends. Think about skin diseases beyond the occasional infected scratch. We're talking chronic, itchy, sometimes weeping conditions. Fungal infections like ringworm must have been common in the warm climate, spreading easily through contact or shared items. Imagine those persistent, itchy red rings appearing on your skin, maybe on your scalp, causing hair loss. They had remedies, often involving minerals like copper salts or sulfur, which might have had some antifungal effect. But relief was likely temporary, and the infection could easily return or spread through a household. Then there's leishmaniasis. This nasty disease is spread by the bite of infected sandflies, tiny little flies, smaller than mosquitoes, that breed in damp soil, animal burrows, or cracks in walls. Depending on the type, it could cause large, persistent skin ulcers that might take months or even years to heal, leaving disfiguring scars. Or, in its visceral form, it attacks internal organs like the spleen and liver, causing fever, weight loss, and enlargement of the organs, often fatal if untreated. While diagnosing it precisely from ancient texts is hard, the prevalence of sandflies and descriptions of chronic ulcers or wasting illnesses suggest it was likely part of the disease landscape, another hidden danger delivered by a tiny insect bite. And what about things like scabies? Caused by microscopic mites burrowing under the skin, it leads to intense itching, especially at night, and a characteristic rash. It spreads like wildfire in crowded conditions through close physical contact. Imagine an entire family scratching themselves raw, unable to sleep properly for weeks on end. Again, treatments might involve sulfurous ointments or herbal washes, but eradicating it completely from a household without modern understanding or medications would be incredibly difficult. These chronic skin conditions weren't just physically uncomfortable, they were visible. People might stare. You might feel ashamed or unclean. It added another layer to the social anxieties we discussed earlier, and the constant scratching. It broke the skin barrier, opening the door for secondary bacterial infections, turning a merely miserable condition into something potentially dangerous. Just another way the environment and its smallest inhabitants seemed constantly determined to make life difficult. We humans weren't the only ones suffering from pests and diseases. The animals that Egyptians relied on so heavily, cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, poultry, were also under constant attack, and this had major knock-on effects for the people themselves. Imagine being a farmer whose prized ox, essential for ploughing the fields, suddenly falls ill. Maybe it develops sores, loses weight, or stops eating. Or perhaps your flock of sheep starts coughing or develops a strange skin condition. Livestock diseases, many spread by insects or ticks, or through contaminated water and fodder, were a constant threat to livelihood. Ticks, for example, could transmit various fevers and debilitating conditions to cattle. Biting flies could torment animals relentlessly, causing stress, reducing milk yield, and potentially spreading diseases like anthrax, which could also infect humans handling sick animals or contaminated hides. Internal parasites, similar to the ones plaguing humans, also afflicted livestock. Worms could infest their guts, draining their energy and making them less productive. Liver flukes, contracted from grazing in marshy areas where infected snails lived, sound familiar, could cause severe liver damage in cattle and sheep. Losing animals to disease wasn't just an emotional blow, it was an economic disaster. It meant less food, less milk, less wool, less power for farming, and less wealth. And the connection wasn't just economic, it was also about health. Some diseases could jump from animals to humans, zoonotic diseases. Anthrax, as mentioned, was one possibility. Brucellosis, contracted from infected milk or contact with infected animals, could cause recurring fevers and joint pain in humans. Rabies, though perhaps less common, could be transmitted by bites from infected dogs or wild animals. Living in close proximity to livestock, sometimes even sharing living quarters during colder weather, increased the risk of disease transmission in both directions. Poultry, kept in household yards, would attract flies and rodents, contributing to the general pest load around homes. They could also suffer from their own diseases and parasites. Even the revered cats, valued for their pest control abilities, could carry fleas that might bite humans, or potentially transmit other minor diseases. The health of the animal population was inextricably linked to the health and prosperity of the human population. An outbreak among the herds could spell ruin for a farmer and hardship for the community, another layer of vulnerability in their world. Faced with this relentless onslaught from the microscopic and the creepy crawly, did communities just passively suffer? Not entirely. While their understanding was limited, there were likely some collective, if rudimentary, attempts to manage the worst of the problems, driven by practical observation and perhaps strong leadership or religious directives. Think about waste management again. While individual households might be careless, villages or towns might have designated refuse areas, trying to keep the worst of the garbage somewhat contained, away from dwellings and water sources. Was it effective? Probably only partially, but it shows an awareness that accumulating filth wasn't good. Similarly, keeping livestock pens reasonably clean, or located slightly away from living quarters, might have been encouraged in some communities. When it came to major threats like locust swarms, the response had to be communal. One person banging a pot wouldn't do much, but the entire village rushing out, shouting, making noise, trying to create smoke. That was a collective effort born of shared desperation. It was an attempt, however futile it often was, to actively fight back against an overwhelming natural force. In times of epidemics, maybe a sudden spike in deaths from dysentery or an unknown fever, communities might react with fear, but perhaps also with collective religious action. Increased offerings to healing deities like Sekhmet or Isis, public purification rituals, or temporary avoidance of certain areas or activities might have occurred. While not based on germ theory, these actions provided a sense of communal response and psychological comfort. There might also have been shared knowledge about practical prevention. Experienced farmers knew which areas were prone to certain pests or diseases affecting crops or livestock. Midwives shared techniques for childbirth, some perhaps safer than others. Elders might advise on which water sources were generally considered cleaner or how best to store grain based on generations of trial and error. This collective wisdom, passed down orally, formed a crucial part of the community's defense strategy, even if imperfect. It wasn't organized public health in the modern sense, of course, but through shared experience, religious frameworks, and practical necessity, communities likely developed their own localized strategies for trying to mitigate the constant pressure of pests and disease. It was a testament to human resilience and the need to cooperate, even when facing threats they didn't fully understand. So, after this whirlwind tour of just some of the things trying to bite, infect, infest, or poison you in ancient Egypt, What's the takeaway? It wasn't just about isolated incidents. It was about a constant, grinding, low-level warfare against the environment and its smallest, most persistent inhabitants. Life wasn't a peaceful drift down the Nile, punctuated by occasional problems. It was an ongoing negotiation with discomfort, risk, and loss. Imagine the sheer amount of time and energy spent, day after day, just trying to keep things at bay. Shaking out bedding to check for scorpions, carefully inspecting grain for weevils, constantly swatting flies, trying to soothe itchy skin or aching teeth, worrying about the river's invisible threats or the stability of your food supply. It was an exhausting backdrop to everything else, raising families, farming, building, worshipping. This constant pressure must have bred a certain kind of resilience, a toughness, perhaps even a degree of fatalism. You couldn't afford to be overly precious or easily discouraged. You patched things up, you carried on, you relied on your community, your gods, your amulets, and whatever practical knowledge you possessed. You accepted that suffering and loss were part of life, even while doing everything in your power to avoid them. The gross factor we mentioned in the title wasn't just about isolated, disgusting moments. It was woven into the fabric of existence. The smells, the sights, the constant proximity to decay, waste, and disease. It shaped their sensory world in ways we can barely imagine today. Accustomed as we are to sanitation, sterile environments, and effective medicine, it makes you appreciate the sheer tenacity of the civilization. Despite all these challenges, they built pyramids, created stunning art, developed complex writing systems, and managed a sophisticated society for millennia. They did it all while simultaneously battling flies, worms, rats, lice, locusts, microbes, and the myriad other pests and diseases that saw them as just another resource or habitat. It puts their achievements in a different, perhaps even more impressive, light. They weren't just building monuments. They were building a civilization in defiance of a world that often seemed determined to tear it down, one tiny bite or infection at a time. You might think that temples, the grand houses of the gods, would be pristine sanctuaries, somehow immune to the everyday grime and pests that plagued ordinary homes. Well, think again. While priests certainly valued ritual purity and cleanliness, keeping a massive temple complex completely free of critters was likely an impossible task. Temples were busy places. Not just priests performing rituals, but also administrators, craftspeople maintaining the buildings, pilgrims bringing offerings, and staff managing vast temple estates and workshops. All this activity meant people coming and going, bringing dirt and potentially pests with them. More importantly, temples often involved large-scale food preparation and storage. Offerings to the gods frequently included bread, beer, meat, fruit, and vegetables. While the gods might partake spiritually, the physical offerings didn't just vanish. They were often redistributed to temple staff or left on offering tables, becoming an irresistible buffet for flies, ants, mice, and rats. Imagine the scene in a temple kitchen or storeroom, likely just as prone to infestations as any other large food handling area, perhaps even more so given the sheer volume. Keeping the sacred offering bread free from weevils, or the temple beer jars sealed against thirsty insects, would require constant vigilance. Incense was burned constantly in temples, partly for ritual purposes, but the thick smoke might have also served as a mild, if unintentional, insect repellent in enclosed spaces. Sacred animals kept in temple precincts, cats in the temples of Bastet, crocodiles in Sobek's temples, ibises associated with Thoth, would also bring their own parasites, fleas, ticks, into the sacred space. Maintaining the cleanliness of their enclosures would be another ongoing chore for temple staff. Even the structure itself wasn't immune. The massive stone columns and walls offered cool, shady crevices where insects or geckos might hide. Wooden elements in roofs or furniture could be susceptible to termites or wood-boring beetles. Pigeons or other birds might nest high up in the hypostyle halls, their droppings fouling the stonework below. Ritual purity was paramount, involving frequent washing by priests, and specific cleansing ceremonies for sacred spaces. But this was more about spiritual contamination than microbial hygiene. While washing hands is always good, it wouldn't stop a mouse from scurrying across the sanctuary floor in the dead of night, or flies from buzzing around an offering table. Even the houses of the gods weren't entirely safe from the persistent, pervasive presence of Egypt's less welcome inhabitants. We mentioned beer was a staple, often used as payment for labor. It wasn't quite like the beer we know today. Thicker, more nutritious, almost like liquid bread, and generally lower in alcohol. But how safe was it to drink, especially considering the challenges with clean water and storage? Making beer involved soaking grain, usually barley or emmer wheat, until it sprouted, drying it, mashing it, mixing it with water, and letting it ferment. The fermentation process itself, producing alcohol, actually helped kill off some harmful bacteria that might have been present in the water used. So, in a way, drinking beer could sometimes be safer than drinking untreated Nile water. It provided hydration and calories with a reduced risk of certain waterborne pathogens. A definite plus. However, the process wasn't sterile. The grain itself could be contaminated with mold or insects before brewing even began. The water added might not be perfectly clean, and the fermentation vessels, large pottery jars, could harbour bacteria or wild yeasts if not cleaned thoroughly between batches. This could lead to off flavours, spoilage, or potentially the growth of harmful microorganisms, especially if the fermentation didn't produce enough alcohol quickly enough. And then there was storage. Beer was often stored in those same pottery jars, maybe sealed with mud stoppers or cloth. Perfect targets for thirsty insects like ants or flies if the seal wasn't perfect. Imagine finding little critters floating in your daily ration of beer. Probably not uncommon. Worse, if the seal failed or the pottery was porous, bacteria could get in, turning the beer sour and undrinkable, or potentially making it unsafe. Wine, mostly enjoyed by the elite, faced similar challenges. Grapes had to be protected from insects and mold in the vineyard and during processing. Fermentation and storage in amphorae required careful sealing to prevent spoilage or contamination. While the higher alcohol content of wine offered more protection than beer, it wasn't immune to problems. So, while beer might have been a relatively safer source of hydration than plain river water sometimes, it wasn't without its own risks. Quality control was variable, relying on the skill of the brewer and the cleanliness of their equipment. A bad batch could mean not just unpleasant taste, but potentially another source of stomach upset or illness. It was liquid bread, yes, but sometimes it came with unwanted extras. We've swatted away flies, scratched flea bites, and worried about sandflies. But let's not forget another buzzing menace, especially prevalent near the marshy areas of the Nile or during the inundation season: mosquitoes. While the ancient Egyptians wouldn't have known about malaria or other mosquito-borne viruses like West Nile, they certainly knew the misery of being bitten. Imagine trying to sleep on a warm night near the river. The air is still, humid, and then you hear it, that high-pitched whine near your ear. You swat, maybe miss. Then another whine. Soon, you're covered in itchy red welts. Sleep becomes impossible. It's not just the itching, it's the constant annoyance, the disruption of precious rest needed after a hard day's work. Did they connect the bites to subsequent fevers? It's hard to say definitively from the texts. They certainly documented fevers, shemu in Egyptian, often attributing them to supernatural causes or bad air, miasma. But it's plausible that observant individuals might have noticed a correlation between periods of intense mosquito activity and outbreaks of feverish illnesses, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. Malaria was likely endemic in the region, causing recurring cycles of fever, chills, and sweating, debilitating its victims and contributing significantly to mortality, especially among children. How did they cope? Smoke was likely a primary defense. Keeping small fires smoldering, using smoky incense, or burning certain types of dung or herbs might have helped keep mosquitoes at bay, at least partially, in homes or campsites. Sleeping on higher ground or rooftops, where breezes might be stronger, could offer some relief. Perhaps they used natural repellents derived from plants, rubbing oils or crushed leaves on their skin, though the effectiveness would have varied wildly. Wealthier individuals might have had finer nets or screens for windows or beds, offering better protection. But for the average person, it was likely a nightly battle armed with little more than a swatting hand and maybe some smoky air. The constant irritation, the lost sleep, and the potential for debilitating fevers delivered by these tiny vampires were just another part of the health burden they had to bear. Just when you thought you'd dealt with the flies and fleas, another winged pest arrived to drain your blood and potentially leave a deadly parting gift. Beyond the infectious diseases and the creepy crawlies, the Egyptian environment held other, more subtle dangers. Poisons lurking in plants, minerals, or even improperly prepared remedies. Accidental poisoning was likely another hazard of daily life, often misunderstood and attributed to other causes. Many plants native to the region contain toxic compounds. Think about children foraging for berries or roots, or adults gathering wild herbs for food or medicine without certain knowledge. Mistaking a poisonous plant for an edible one could have disastrous consequences: severe stomach upset, neurological symptoms, organ damage, or even death. The castor bean plant, for instance, source of castor oil, used as a purgative, contains the deadly toxin ricin if not processed correctly. Oleander, with its attractive flowers, is highly toxic if ingested. Identifying plants correctly was a vital skill, but mistakes could happen. Minerals used in crafts, cosmetics, or medicine also posed risks. Lead, found in coal eyeliner and some medical preparations, could lead to chronic lead poisoning over time, causing developmental problems, anemia, and neurological issues. Arsenic and mercury compounds, sometimes used as pigments or in dubious medicinal concoctions, are also highly toxic. Workers involved in mining or processing these minerals would face higher exposure risks. Even food preparation could introduce toxins. Certain types of fish or shellfish might accumulate toxins depending on the season or location. Improperly stored grain could develop harmful molds producing mycotoxins, as we mentioned earlier. The potential for accidental poisoning was woven into the environment and daily activities. When someone fell suddenly ill with vomiting, convulsions, or unexplained symptoms after eating or taking a remedy, people might suspect witchcraft or divine anger. While intentional poisoning certainly occurred, many cases might have been tragic accidents resulting from interaction with the natural toxins present in their world. The physicians, relying on observation and traditional knowledge, might struggle to diagnose or treat such poisonings effectively, often resorting to purgatives or magical interventions that might do little good. It was another invisible threat, adding to the precariousness of existence, where even a simple meal or a common plant could potentially harbour a hidden danger. We've talked a lot about the general population, but how did the constant barrage of pests and diseases specifically impact the elderly in ancient Egypt? As people aged, their resilience often waned, making them particularly vulnerable to the hazards we've been exploring. Imagine your eyesight fading, your hearing diminishing, your joints aching. Simple tasks like spotting a scorpion hiding in a dark corner, hearing the scurry of rats in the walls, or quickly swatting away flies become much harder. Reduced mobility might mean you can't easily escape a swarm of insects or keep your immediate surroundings as clean. You might be more confined to your home, potentially increasing exposure to household pests like fleas or bedbugs if hygiene is difficult to maintain. Years of exposure to harsh conditions, inhaling dust, drinking contaminated water, suffering repeated infections, would take their toll. Chronic conditions like arthritis, evident in many mummies, respiratory problems, or the long-term effects of parasites like schistosomiasis would likely worsen with age. A lifetime of wear and tear on teeth could lead to painful abscesses or difficulty eating, contributing to malnutrition in later life. The immune system naturally weakens with age, making seniors more susceptible to infections that younger, healthier adults might fight off. A bout of dysentery or pneumonia, dangerous for anyone, could be rapidly fatal for an elderly person. Even seemingly minor infections could escalate quickly. Furthermore, the elderly often relied on younger family members for care. If the family was struggling with its own illnesses or hardships, providing adequate care, ensuring cleanliness, preparing suitable food, administering remedies, might be challenging. Social support was crucial, but the burden of care in a world without modern medicine or social safety nets was immense. While elders were respected for their wisdom and experience, their later years were often fraught with increased physical vulnerability. The pests and diseases that were a constant nuisance throughout life could become truly life-threatening challenges in old age. Surviving to see grey hairs, or perhaps a bald head given the lice remedies, was an achievement in itself. But those twilight years were likely far from golden for many, overshadowed by the accumulated toll of a lifetime battling Egypt's less glamorous inhabitants. We often think of the Nile flood, the inundation, as a predictable, life-giving event, and usually it was. But the flood wasn't always perfect. Sometimes it was too low, sometimes too high, and these fluctuations brought their own specific set of pest-related miseries. A low Nile meant less water for irrigation, leading to smaller harvests and potential food shortages. But it also meant that the river's flow was slower, creating more stagnant pools and marshy areas along the banks, perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes, hello malaria, and the snails that carry schistosomiasis. So, a year of poor harvest could also be a year of increased disease risk from these vectors. Furthermore, with less water available, people and animals might congregate more closely around the remaining water sources, increasing the chances of contamination and the spread of waterborne diseases like dysentery. Conversely, an excessively high Nile, while potentially bringing more fertile silt, could be devastating in other ways. Destructive floods could wipe out villages near the riverbank, destroying homes and stored food supplies. This displacement would force people into crowded, temporary shelters, creating ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infectious diseases and parasites like lice and fleas. The floodwaters themselves could become heavily contaminated with waste and carcasses, spreading disease wherever they reached. And as the waters receded, they would leave behind vast areas of damp ground, again perfect for mosquitoes and snails to breed, potentially leading to disease outbreaks. After the immediate flood danger had passed, rodent populations might also fluctuate with the flood levels. A high flood could drown many rats and mice in low-lying areas, but the survivors might then swarm into villages seeking higher ground and food, leading to sudden infestations. A low flood might allow rodent populations to build up more steadily due to less disruption. These variations in the inundation added another layer of unpredictability to life. You weren't just dealing with the baseline level of pests and diseases, you were also subject to booms and busts driven by the river's whims. A bad Nile didn't just mean potential hunger, it often meant an upswing in sickness too, a double blow delivered by the very river that sustained them. It highlights how intimately their health and well-being were tied to the rhythms of their environment, and how vulnerable they were when those rhythms faltered. Egypt wasn't an isolated bubble. It was a hub of trade, connected to Nubia to the south, the Levant to the east, and the Mediterranean world to the north. Caravans crossed the deserts, ships sailed the Nile and the sea. This movement of people and goods, while essential for the economy and cultural exchange, was also a perfect highway for pests and diseases to travel. Imagine a merchant ship docking at a port like Alexandria or Pelusium after a voyage. Its cargo hold, filled with grain, timber, or textiles from distant lands, could easily harbour stowaways, rats carrying fleas potentially infected with new strains of disease, or insects like grain beetles hidden in sacks. These unwelcome travellers could then disembark and establish themselves in a new environment, introducing pests or diseases that the local population had little immunity against. Likewise, caravans travelling overland could carry pests in their goods or among their pack animals. Insects could hide in bundles of cloth. Rodents might hitch a ride in food supplies. Travellers themselves, moving from one region to another, could carry lice, fleas, or infectious diseases, unknowingly spreading them along their route. Major trade centers and ports, with their constant influx of people and goods from diverse origins, would have been hotspots for the introduction and mixing of different pests and pathogens. Did the Egyptians understand this risk? Probably not in a scientific way, but they might have observed that sickness sometimes seemed to follow the arrival of foreign ships or caravans, leading to suspicion or fear directed towards outsiders during times of epidemic. Quarantine measures, as we understand them, didn't really exist, though access to certain cities or regions might be restricted during severe outbreaks for practical or religious reasons. The movement wasn't just into Egypt either. Egyptian ships and caravans traveling abroad could just as easily carry their native pests. Nile Valley mosquitoes breeding in water barrels on ships. Egyptian fleas hopping onto new hosts in foreign ports. This exchange, driven by trade and diplomacy, meant that the pestilent challenges faced by Egyptians were part of a larger, interconnected ancient world problem. Your local fly problem might have distant cousins who arrived on the last shipment of cedar wood from Lebanon. Did all this misery, the itching, the sickness, the buzzing flies, the threat of snakes, leave any mark on Egyptian culture beyond medical texts and magical spells? It's subtle, but perhaps we can see glimpses of this constant battle reflected in their art, language, or even their proverbs. Think about the meticulous depictions of nature in tomb paintings. While often idealized, they include detailed renderings of insects, birds, fish, and mammals. Flies, locusts, and beetles appear. Are these just decorative elements, or do they sometimes carry a deeper meaning, reflecting the inescapable presence of these creatures in daily life? The scarab beetle, of course, became a powerful symbol of rebirth, perhaps elevating one specific insect above its more bothersome brethren. But the sheer presence of accurately depicted insects in their art shows they were paying close attention. In language, hieroglyphs themselves sometimes incorporated insects or animals associated with disease or danger. While often just phonetic or determinative signs, their choice might occasionally hint at underlying associations. Proverbs or wisdom texts sometimes warn against gluttony or uncleanliness, perhaps indirectly acknowledging the health risks associated with poor hygiene or spoiled food, even without understanding the germ theory. Could the emphasis on order, ma'at, versus chaos, isfet, in their cosmology also reflect on a mundane level the constant struggle to keep the chaotic forces of nature, including pests and disease, at bay? Maintaining cleanliness, securing food stores, performing protective rituals. These could be seen as small, everyday acts of upholding ma'at against the encroaching chaos represented by decay, infestation, and illness. The prevalence of protective amulets, worn by nearly everyone, speaks volumes about the perceived level of threat in the world. It suggests a society deeply aware of its vulnerability, seeking constant magical reinforcement against unseen dangers, many of which likely stemmed from the pests and diseases we've discussed. It's not always explicit. They didn't leave behind detailed accounts complaining about flea bites or lamenting the common cold. But the sheer pervasiveness of these problems must have colored their experience of the world, perhaps fostering a pragmatic acceptance of hardship, a strong reliance on divine protection, and a deep appreciation for the moments of health, peace, and abundance they did enjoy. The shadow of the pest was long, potentially influencing their art, beliefs, and worldview in ways we can only glimpse. How do we even know about all these gruesome details? It's not like the average Egyptian farmer kept a diary detailing his struggles with weevils and worms. Our picture comes from piecing together clues from different sources, like detectives investigating a very old, very itchy crime scene. Archaeology plays a huge part. Excavating ancient homes and settlements reveals the structures themselves, the mud brick walls, the earth floors, the granaries, showing us the environments where pests thrived. They find pottery jars that might have stored food, sometimes with remnants inside, tools used for farming or crafts, and even desiccated remains of pests themselves, insect casings, rodent bones, preserved in the dry climate. The study of human remains, paleopathology, is crucial. Examining skeletons and mummies can reveal evidence of diseases like tuberculosis, Pott's disease, arthritis, or severe dental wear and abscesses. Sometimes, incredibly, Parasites like schistosoma eggs or tapeworm segments are found preserved within mummified bodies, giving us direct proof of these infestations. Ancient texts, while often focused on royalty, religion, or administration, provide glimpses too. Medical papyri, like the Ebers or Edwin Smith papyri, list remedies for various ailments, describing symptoms that we can sometimes tentatively link to specific diseases or parasite infections. They mention treatments for wounds, eye problems, coughs, stomach issues, and even prescribe fumigation methods or spells against pests like snakes or rats. Literary texts or letters might occasionally mention hardships, illnesses, or environmental problems like locust plagues. Art, as we touched on, depicts daily life, including interactions with animals and the environment. While often idealized, these scenes can show agricultural practices, food preparation, or housing conditions, offering visual context. It's like assembling a giant, fragmented jigsaw puzzle. No single piece gives the full picture, but by combining evidence from bones, texts, artifacts, and art, we can start to build a plausible reconstruction of the constant, unglamorous struggle against pests and disease that formed the backdrop to the grand narrative of ancient Egypt. It reminds us that history isn't just about pharaohs and pyramids. It's also about the everyday resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary and often quite disgusting challenges. And exhale. We've made it back from our little trip through the less than sanitary side of ancient Egypt. From the buzzing flies and crawling lice to the invisible threats in the water and the slow creep of disease, it really paints a different picture, doesn't it? Life wasn't just about building magnificent tombs. For most people, it was a daily, gritty struggle against things that wanted to bite, infest, or infect them. It makes you appreciate your modern plumbing, your window screens, and maybe even your boring office job just a little bit more, right? It's a testament to their resilience, their ingenuity, even when it involved dung poultices, and perhaps their sheer stubbornness that they managed to build such an enduring civilization amidst it all. They faced challenges we can barely comprehend today, armed with little more than basic tools, herbal remedies, and a whole lot of faith and magic. So next time you see those serene statues or intricate hieroglyphs, maybe spare a thought for the ordinary Egyptian who likely spent part of their day swatting flies, scratching bites, or worrying about the weevils in their bread. Thinking about those physicians, the SW&W, trying to treat injuries and illnesses, what tools did they actually have at their disposal? It wasn't exactly a sterile stainless steel setup. Their toolkit, often made from bronze, copper, or even flint, had its own set of potential problems. Archaeological finds and depictions show various instruments, knives and scalpels for cutting, forceps for gripping or extracting things, like splinters, or maybe teeth, probes for exploring wounds, cautery tools for burning tissue to stop bleeding or treat growths, and possibly rudimentary drills for trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, a rare but known practice. Flint blades, while incredibly sharp, could shatter or leave tiny fragments in a wound. Bronze or copper tools would corrode, potentially introducing metallic salts into tissues. And more importantly, they were difficult to sterilize effectively. Imagine surgery, even something relatively minor like lancing an abscess or stitching a wound. The physician might wash their hands, maybe even rinse the tools in water or wine, but true sterilization wasn't understood. The same knife used on one patient might be used on the next with only a cursory cleaning. The risk of transferring infection from one person to another, or introducing bacteria from the tool itself into a wound, was enormous. A procedure intended to help could easily lead to a fatal secondary infection like sepsis or gangrene. Bandaging materials, usually linen strips, might not be sterile either. While linen is absorbent, reused or improperly stored bandages could harbor bacteria. They did use substances like honey or willow bark on wounds, which had some beneficial properties, but these might be applied with unwashed hands or contaminated tools. Even diagnosis relied on basic tools: their eyes, ears, hands, and perhaps probes. They couldn't see inside the body like we can with X-rays or scans, They listened to chests, felt for pulses or swellings, examined urine and feces, but their ability to pinpoint the exact cause of internal problems was very limited. Treatment was often based on symptoms rather than a clear diagnosis, leading to approaches that might be ineffective or even harmful for the actual underlying condition. So, while physicians possessed practical skills, especially in areas like bone setting, their limited toolkit and lack of understanding about infection control meant that seeking medical help was always fraught with risk. The very instruments intended to heal could inadvertently become vectors for more suffering. We wear clothes, we sleep in bedding, pretty basic stuff. But for the ancient Egyptians, even their textiles weren't safe from the pest onslaught. Keeping clothes and linens clean and intact was another chore made harder by tiny destructive forces. The primary material was linen, made from flax. While durable, it wasn't indestructible. Insects like clothes moths, or similar species, could infest stored textiles, their larvae happily munching away, leaving behind holes and damage. Imagine carefully weaving and storing fine linen garments, perhaps for special occasions or as part of a dowry, only to find them riddled with moth larvae when you take them out. Frustrating, to say the least. Then there were the beetles. Certain types, like carpet beetles, have larvae, often called woolly bears, that feed on natural fibres, including linen, wool, used less often but sometimes for cloaks or blankets, and leather. These could infest stored clothing, bedding, rugs, or wall hangings, slowly causing damage over time. Storage methods were key. Clothes were often kept in wooden chests or pottery jars. A well-sealed chest might offer some protection, but insects could still find their way in through cracks or gaps. Regular airing and cleaning of stored textiles would have been necessary, but likely difficult to do consistently. And let's not forget simple staining and soiling. In an environment with so much dust, mud, potential for food spills, and proximity to animals and waste, keeping clothes clean was a challenge. Washing was done, often in the Nile or canals using natron, but frequent washing could also wear out the fabric faster. Stains from things like grease, blood, or certain plant materials might be difficult or impossible to remove completely. Even worse, textiles could harbour pests that directly affected humans. Fleas and lice could easily hide in the seams or folds of clothing or bedding, reinfesting people even after they tried to clean themselves. Bedbugs, though less definitively documented, might also have been present, hiding in sleeping mats or wooden bed frames and emerging at night to bite. So, your clothes weren't just about fashion or keeping warm, cool. They were another potential habitat for pests and a constant target for damage. Maintaining a decent wardrobe required ongoing effort against both wear and tear and the tiny creatures trying to eat or live in your garments. Papyrus, the iconic writing material of ancient Egypt, used for everything from sacred texts and administrative records to personal letters and laundry lists. But even these precious documents weren't safe from the ravages of pests. Papyrus is essentially a plant-based paper, made from the processed stems of the papyrus reed. And like any plant-based material, it was food for certain insects. Silverfish, for example, are known to feed on starchy materials like paper and glue. Imagine these small, wriggling insects finding their way into a library or archive, or even just a stored scroll in someone's home, and slowly nibbling away at the edges or surfaces, damaging the text. Book lice, saucids, are another group of tiny insects that thrive in damp conditions and feed on microscopic mold that can grow on materials like papyrus, especially if stored improperly. While they might not eat the papyrus directly, their presence indicates poor storage conditions, and the mold they feed on can stain and damage the scroll. Termites, though perhaps more associated with wood, could potentially damage papyrus scrolls stored in wooden chests or near infested structural timbers. Rodents too might gnaw on scrolls, not necessarily for food, but perhaps for nesting material, or just out of curiosity. Scribes and archivists likely knew about these risks. They might have tried storing scrolls in sealed pottery jars or chests, perhaps using certain aromatic herbs or minerals as repellents, though the effectiveness is uncertain. Careful handling and storage in dry conditions were the best defense. The dry climate of Egypt itself was a major factor in preserving so many papyri for us today, desiccating both the material and potential pests. But damage still occurred. We find ancient papyri that show clear signs of insect damage, small holes, chewed edges, tracks left by larvae. It adds another layer to the challenge faced by scribes and administrators. Not only did they have to meticulously write and record information, but they also had to constantly battle the environment and its inhabitants to preserve that knowledge for the future. Every surviving scroll is a testament not only to the scribe who wrote it, but also to its successful evasion of hungry insects and rodents over millennia. We've talked about the big, dramatic pests, locusts, rats, snakes, but what about the small, persistent, seemingly endless armies of ants? They might not carry deadly diseases like mosquitoes or cause the immediate panic of a scorpion, but their sheer numbers and persistence could make life incredibly annoying and lead to significant losses, especially concerning food. Imagine your simple home. Ants would inevitably find their way in, exploring every surface in their relentless search for sustenance. A tiny crumb dropped on the floor, a sticky spot of spilled beer or honey, improperly sealed food containers, all would quickly attract trails of ants. You'd find them swarming over leftovers, marching across tables, even exploring bedding if you happened to snack there. Keeping them out of stored food was a constant battle. While pottery jars helped, ants are tiny and persistent. They could exploit the smallest crack in a lid or seal. Storing food by suspending it from the ceiling might deter rodents, but ants could often still find a way, climbing down walls or ropes. They could get into sacks of grain, containers of dried fruit, jars of honey or oil, contaminating them and slowly carrying away precious calories. Certain types of ants could also inflict painful bites or stings, adding physical discomfort to the annoyance. While perhaps not medically serious most of the time, multiple bites could certainly be unpleasant, especially for children playing on the floor. Outdoors, ants were just as prevalent. Farmers might have to contend with ants damaging seeds or young plants. They could swarm around harvested crops laid out to dry. Their nests, sometimes built near homes or pathways, could be disturbed, leading to aggressive swarms emerging to defend their territory. Did the Egyptians have specific anti-ant strategies? Probably nothing sophisticated. Keeping homes clean and food sealed was the best defense. Perhaps they used certain strong-smelling herbs or substances around storage areas, hoping to repel them. Maybe they poured hot water on nests near the home. But mostly, it was likely a case of constant vigilance, sweeping them away, and accepting their presence as another unavoidable nuisance. They were the tiny, ever-present thieves and irritants, a constant reminder that even the smallest creatures could make life difficult in ancient Egypt. Let's think about the artisans again. The sculptors, painters, carpenters, and jewelers who created the beautiful objects we admire in museums. Their work required skill, patience, and often valuable materials. And yes, pests could interfere here too, damaging not just finished products, but the raw materials themselves. Carpenters working with wood, whether local timbers like acacia or sycamore fig, or expensive imported cedar, had to contend with wood-boring insects like beetles or termites. An infestation could weaken the wood, riddle it with holes, or even destroy it completely. Imagine carefully carving a piece of furniture or a statue, only to discover insect tunnels compromising its structure. They might try using certain oils or resins as protective coatings, but effectiveness would vary. Painters used pigments derived from minerals, like ochre for reds and yellows, malachite for green, azurite for blue, carbon black, gypsum white, mixed with binders, likely gum arabic or animal glue. These pigments, stored as powders or cakes, could potentially be contaminated by insects or mold if stored improperly, especially in damp conditions. The binders themselves, being organic, could attract pests. Imagine finding your precious, expensive blue pigment crawling with tiny beetles, or your paint becoming moldy and unusable. Sculptors working with stone faced fewer pest problems with the material itself, but the dusty conditions of their workshops, as we mentioned, posed health risks. And finished statues, especially if painted or adorned with other materials, weren't immune. Insects or rodents might damage applied gilding, inlaid eyes made of organic materials, or any textile elements incorporated. Jewelers used precious metals, but also incorporated materials like faience, a type of glazed ceramic, semi-precious stones, and sometimes organic elements like shells, ivory, or bone. While metals were safe, organic components could be vulnerable to boring insects or environmental degradation exacerbated by pests. Glues used in assembling jewelry could also potentially attract insects. Even the tools artisans used, wooden mallets, brushes with natural bristles, leather components, could be damaged by pests over time. It was another layer of frustration and potential economic loss. Protecting not just their health, but also their valuable materials and finished work from the constant threat of infestation and decay was part of the artisan's daily challenge. We've touched on the dangers faced by infants. But what about slightly older children? Childhood in ancient Egypt wasn't all carefree play. It was also a period of high vulnerability to the pests and diseases surrounding them, shaping their early experiences in profound ways. Imagine children playing outdoors, barefoot, near the Nile or in village lanes. They were constantly exposed to contaminated soil and water. Hookworm larvae could burrow through the soles of their feet. They might accidentally ingest parasite eggs while playing or putting dirty hands in their mouths. They were prime targets for mosquito bites while playing near water sources, increasing their risk of malaria. Their natural curiosity might lead them to poke at interesting-looking insects or creatures, risking bites or stings from scorpions, snakes, or venomous spiders hidden under rocks or debris. Inside the home, they were just as exposed as adults, perhaps more so. Crawling infants or toddlers exploring the floor could easily come into contact with dirt, animal droppings, or pests. Sharing close quarters with family members and potentially animals made them susceptible to catching colds, coughs, skin infections like ringworm or scabies, and parasites like lice. Their smaller bodies and developing immune systems meant they often suffered more severely from illnesses that an adult might weather. Diarrheal diseases, leading to rapid dehydration, were a leading cause of child mortality. Respiratory infections could quickly become serious. Common childhood diseases, for which we now have vaccines, would have run rampant, potentially causing lifelong disability or death. Even their education, for those fortunate enough to receive it, wasn't immune. Scribe schools, where boys learn to read and write, might involve long hours spent indoors, potentially in crowded conditions, facilitating the spread of coughs and colds. Eye strain from reading scrolls in poor light was likely common. Play itself could be hazardous. Toys, often simple objects made of wood, clay, or cloth, could harbour dirt or splinters. Playing games outdoors exposed them to all the environmental risks. This constant exposure to danger and disease undoubtedly contributed to the tragically high child mortality rates. Parents loved their children dearly, as evidenced by affectionate depictions and burial practices, but they lived with the constant fear of losing them to sickness or accident. Childhood was a precious but perilous stage of life, lived under the constant shadow of pests and disease. We've mentioned trying to sleep amidst mosquitoes, fleas, or lice, but achieving truly restful sleep in ancient Egypt faced other pest-related hurdles too. It wasn't just about the things actively biting you. The whole environment could conspire against a good night's rest. Imagine the sounds. We talked about rats and mice scurrying in the walls or ceilings. That constant scratching, gnawing, or pattering sound right near where you're trying to sleep would be incredibly disruptive. Add to that the buzzing of flies that might still be active indoors, the chirping of crickets or geckos, which, while eating insects, also made noise, maybe the barking or howling of neighborhood dogs disturbed by nocturnal activity. Silence was likely a rare commodity. Then there were the smells. If your home was near refuse heaps, animal pens, or stagnant water, unpleasant odors could easily drift in, especially on warm, still nights. The smell of smoke from indoor fires or lamps might linger. Even the smell of certain pests themselves, the musty odor associated with rodent infestations, for example, could permeate the living space. Hard to relax when the air itself feels unclean. Temperature control was basic. Homes could get stiflingly hot during summer nights, making sleep difficult even without pests. People might sleep outdoors or on rooftops for coolness, but this increased exposure to mosquitoes, dew, and potentially other nocturnal creatures. In cooler weather, huddling indoors for warmth meant closer proximity to any household pests and poorer ventilation. And the constant low-level anxiety we discussed. That doesn't exactly make for easy sleep either. Worrying about whether your stored food is safe, whether that noise outside is just the wind or something more sinister, or simply enduring the physical discomfort of itchy bites or chronic aches and pains, all contribute to poor sleep quality. They didn't have sleep aids or white noise machines. Coping likely involved sheer exhaustion, perhaps the dulling effect of daily beer rations, and maybe prayers or spells for a peaceful night. Achieving deep, restorative sleep, the kind we often take for granted, was likely another daily challenge in their pest-filled world. We briefly mentioned the dangers of quarrying and mining, the dust, the risk of collapse. But these environments, often located in remote desert areas, presented their own unique ecosystem of pests and health hazards beyond the immediate physical dangers. Imagine working long hours in the semi-darkness of a mine tunnel, perhaps searching for gold, copper, or turquoise. Ventilation would be minimal. The air could be thick, not just with rock dust, but potentially with harmful gases like carbon monoxide or radon, although the Egyptians wouldn't have understood this specific risk. The constant inhalation of dust, often containing silica, led to the lung diseases we discussed, a slow killer for many miners. Water seepage in mines could create damp environments ideal for certain types of mold or fungi to grow, potentially causing respiratory issues or skin infections. Stagnant water pools could also attract insects, even underground. And what about the critters? Mines and caves can provide shelter for bats, while bats themselves might not be a direct threat and could eat insects. Their droppings, guano, can harbor fungal spores that cause histoplasmosis, another serious lung infection, if inhaled when the guano is disturbed. Snakes might seek the cool darkness of mine entrances or tunnels. Scorpions and venomous spiders could hide in crevices. Rodents might also infest mine workings, especially if workers stored food nearby, adding their own parasites and disease risks to the mix. Living conditions for miners, often housed in temporary camps near the work sites, were likely basic and crowded. Sanitation would be rudimentary, water might be scarce or contaminated, and food supplies subject to spoilage and infestation. These camps could become breeding grounds for diseases and parasites, easily spreading among the workforce. Working in these remote, dangerous, and often pest-ridden environments was incredibly harsh. It was often undertaken by conscripted labor, prisoners of war, or criminals. Survival rates were likely low, due to accidents, exhaustion, disease, and the generally brutal conditions. The glittering gold or beautiful turquoise that adorned the pharaohs often came at a very high human cost, extracted from environments rife with both visible and invisible dangers. It's worth pondering how the ancient Egyptians themselves perceived cleanliness and dirt. Was their concept the same as ours? Probably not entirely. While they clearly valued personal washing and used cleansing agents like natron, their primary framework for purity seems to have been ritualistic rather than hygienic in the modern sense. Priests, for example, underwent rigorous purification rituals before entering sacred spaces or performing ceremonies. This involved washing, shaving body hair, perhaps partly to combat lice, and wearing clean linen garments. But the focus was on removing spiritual impurity or negative influences, not necessarily microscopic germs they didn't know existed. You could be ritually pure, but still potentially carrying pathogens. Similarly, certain substances were considered ritually unclean or taboo, often related to death, specific animals, or bodily functions. this wasn't always directly linked to physical dirtiness. Conversely, substances we'd consider utterly disgusting, like crocodile dung used in medical remedies, might not have carried the same unclean stigma if they were believed to have magical or medicinal properties. This distinction might explain why seemingly contradictory practices could coexist. People might meticulously wash before entering a temple, yet live in close proximity to waste heaps. They might use spells to ward off disease demons, while simultaneously applying non-sterile dressings to wounds. Their understanding of clean was layered, encompassing physical appearance, smell, ritual status, and magical protection. Physical dirt, grime, and pests were certainly recognized as unpleasant and undesirable. People tried to keep their homes reasonably tidy, wash themselves and their clothes, and protect their food. But the threshold for what was considered acceptably clean was likely much higher than ours, simply due to the environmental realities and lack of effective sanitation or pest control. You couldn't eliminate the dust, the flies, the smells entirely, so you learned to live with a certain level of it. Ritual purity offered a framework for creating zones of perceived safety and order within a world that often felt physically contaminated and chaotic. It was a different way of navigating the constant presence of the gross factor. So, after delving into the dirt, the diseases, the dangers lurking in the water, the workplace, the food, and even the tombs, it paints a rather exhausting picture of daily existence. It's a far cry from the serene images of pharaohs and gods we often associate with ancient Egypt. This constant, grinding pressure from the environment, particularly from pests and pathogens, was the unseen backdrop against which their entire civilization unfolded. It forces us to reconsider what resilience truly meant back then. It wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about actively navigating a world teeming with threats, using a combination of practical knowledge, however limited, communal effort, and deep-seated belief systems involving magic and the divine. Every successful harvest, every child raised to adulthood, every pyramid completed was a victory snatched from an environment that often seemed hostile. Understanding this constant struggle doesn't diminish their achievements. If anything, it enhances them. It highlights the sheer human effort, ingenuity, and perhaps stubbornness required to build and maintain such a complex society for so long under such challenging conditions. The grandeur of their monuments is perhaps even more impressive when you consider the microscopic battles being fought daily by the people who built them. This constant negotiation with pests and disease shaped their lives, their beliefs, their medicine, even potentially their art and language, in ways we are still uncovering. It's a reminder that history is lived in the details. The itch of a flea bite, the worry over spoiled grain, the fear of unseen things in the water, as much as in the grand narratives of kings and conquests. It's the persistent, often unpleasant background noise against which the symphony of a civilization plays out. And so, our long, slow drift through the often unpleasant realities of daily life in ancient Egypt begins to draw to a close. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of the present day begin to settle back around you, gently nudging aside the dust, the flies, the phantom itches we've conjured up together. Can you still almost smell the muddy Nile, the incense, the faint whiff of something unpleasant lurking just out of sight? Can you feel the phantom sensation of rough linen against your skin, or the imagined grit of sand between your teeth? We've walked a mile, or perhaps many miles, in sandals that offered little protection through a world both magnificent and deeply challenging. We journeyed far beyond the golden masks and towering temples, didn't we? We peeked into the simple mud brick homes, waded through the murky waters of the canals, felt the sting of the desert wind, and perhaps even imagined the unsettling crawl of unseen things in the dark. We saw how life wasn't just about grand cosmic battles between gods like Horus and Set, but also about the constant microscopic warfare waged against bacteria, parasites, insects, and rodents. A war fought with rudimentary tools, questionable remedies, potent magic, and sheer enduring resilience. Think about it for a moment. That farmer we imagined, tending his crops under the blazing sun, He wasn't just worried about the harvest yield. He was likely battling schistosomiasis from the water, swatting away flies carrying trachoma, protecting his stored grain from weevils, and hoping a scorpion wasn't hiding in the reeds. That craftsperson in Thebes, creating beautiful pottery, perhaps she was simultaneously dealing with fleas in her bedding, worrying about the quality of the water her children drank, and applying a poultice of questionable origin to an infected cut on her hand. That priest performing sacred rites. Maybe he was distracted by the persistent itch of lice under his clean linen robes, or the knowledge that even the temple storerooms weren't safe from rats. It's a humbling perspective. It reminds us that beneath the veneer of any great civilization lies the complex, often difficult, reality of individual human lives. Lives filled not just with grand purpose, but with mundane struggles, discomforts, and the constant effort to simply stay healthy, safe, and fed in a world that offered few guarantees. The gross factor wasn't just occasional, it was ambient. The pests weren't just invaders, they were cohabitants, an unavoidable part of the ecosystem they lived within. Does knowing all this diminish the wonder of ancient Egypt? I don't think so. For me, it deepens the respect. To build something so lasting, so influential, so breathtakingly ambitious, while simultaneously contending with this level of environmental and biological pressure, it's almost superhuman. It speaks to a strength, a pragmatism, and a profound connection to their belief systems that allowed them to persevere against odds that seem staggering from our modern vantage point. So, as you let the last echoes of the Nile fade from your mind, as the imagined buzzing quiets down, perhaps hold on to that feeling of appreciation. Appreciation for the resilience of those who lived these lives, certainly. But also maybe a quiet appreciation for the simple comforts of your own time. Clean water from a tap, screens on your windows, food stored safely in a refrigerator, medicine that actually targets the cause of illness, the ability to sleep most nights without being relentlessly bitten or hearing things scurrying in the walls. These aren't small things. They are the hard-won victories of centuries of human effort, built upon the experiences of countless generations who navigated worlds far more challenging and, yes, far grosser than our own. It's been a fascinating, if slightly unsettling journey. I hope it's given your mind something interesting to gently turn over as you drift towards sleep. Or perhaps it's already lulled you there. If you've enjoyed this particular exploration of the less glamorous side of history, maybe let us know with a like. It helps others find their way here. And if you'd like to join us again as we unearth more peculiar, forgotten, or just plain weird stories from the past, do consider subscribing. We'll be back soon to whisper more tales from bygone eras into the quiet hours. But until then, may your sleep be deep, peaceful, and entirely free of ancient Egyptian pests. Thank you for joining us once again on Boring History for Sleep. Rest well.